Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Mem Chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Moish Morgenstern in honor of his wife, Leah Mohadeb Morgenstern. I honor your dedication to learn the daf every day. I'm very proud of you. And by Deborah Lewis in honor of Tracy Lewis. For all the support and love, Tracy always encourages me to continue my learning. She is a blessing. And by Harry Green in honor of Karina M. Perry, who has been learning the daf Yomi with Hadron program for a year. She's in the formidable environment of Alaska, doing this on her own. May she continue from strength to strength in her growth and love of Torah. We're going to start now at the bottom. Well, we'll just review quickly from the bottom. We actually got to a bunch of lines into Mem Chet, but I want to remind you where we were up to. So we started toward the top more of Mem Zayin and Mebet with this question of Abaye on Rabbah. Remember, we have Rabbah and Rav Chisda's machloket. We're still in the middle of that about cooking on Yantif for a regular day. Do you get lashes according to Rav Chisda because you don't say hoil, or do we hold like Rabbah who says hoil? Again, what does hoil mean? Since you have some possible explanation, even though it's unrealistic, but it's possibly realistic, where maybe lots of guests will show up, therefore you can say, oh, well, I was really cooking for Yantif, and therefore you don't get lashes for that. So in other words, since there's a potential for the cooking to be Yantif, it's possible that you could, we allow you to do it. So now we have this case, and Rabbah basically holds, we can say hoil. So now the question becomes, if you can say hoil, then this doesn't really make any sense, this source. The source had talked about someone who cooks the sciatic nerve in milk on Yantif, and then he eats it, and he gets 5 sets of lashes. Why 5 sets of lashes? Because cooking gid anasheh on Yom Tov, number 1, you're not allowed to cook on Yantif. Number 2, eating it. You can't eat the gid because it's forbidden to eat the gid. Number 3, cooking basar b'chalav, milk and meat together. Number 4, eating the milk and meat that was cooked together. And number 5, hav'ara, which is making a fire, building a fire on Yantif, not for the purposes of Yantif. So if you say hoil, they say to Rabbah, then you could say, well, I built this right now for Yom Tov, but for cooking, not for anything I needed to eat on Yom Tov, because you can't eat that on Yom Tov because you can't eat it at all. However, maybe you could say, I was going to use the fire, theoretically, I could use the fire to cook my food. So therefore, if you say hoil, then you shouldn't get lashes for hav'ara. So we attempted some different explanations. One of the problems was that Rabbi Chia had said, you get 2 for eating and 3 for cooking, and the one they tried to put in wasn't a cooking one, and it doesn't make sense, then the numbers would be off. So now we have to find something that has to do with cooking. So they suggest maybe the wood you used was muktzah, okay? And that's why, to which they respond. What do you mean? It's muktzah. Muktzah isn't deoraita, right? How could that possibly be, right? Now, as long as they say it's something that there's no hoil about, then we're okay. So it says, right, it was noticed, by the way, we were talking about havara. This connects with havara. It's not the lighting itself, but it's what you lit it with. You lit it with wood that wasn't prepared. What's normally the case? The wood was still on the tree before Shabbat, right? And it's what we call nolad. It's kind of a category of muktzah. It's always a bit of a debate about where exactly we draw the line, and the different is nolad part of muktzah, but right, it wasn't prepared from before. Now, Rabbah says muktzah is d'oraita, which also raised a lot of questions, and I told you they didn't get it. The whole question is, even though we're going to see we reject Rabbah, did Rabbah change his mind about this or not? And from Sugi and Beitza, it seems like Rashi thinks that Rabbah still thinks that muktzah is d'oraita. Some of the Achronim tried to give it explanations. It's only in certain types of muktzah, and they distinguish between, let's say, nolad and other categories possibly. Anyway, there's a whole interesting question about that. Anyone who's interested in muktzah, worth listening to, if your Hebrew is good. In any case, let's just go on and see what he says. So basically, Rabbah says muktzah is d'oraita, to which Abaye, who was questioning him, says, how could you possibly say that? You asked the following question about seba achu. This is a sheep that was grazing in the meadow. Now, a sheep that grazes in the meadow is very far from anywhere, and he wasn't prepared for use on Yom Tov. In other words, in order to be used for a sacrifice, or even to slaughter your animal, I think in general, has to be animals that you set aside before the holiday that you plan to slaughter. In this case, it was so far from anywhere that there's no way you plan to use it, and therefore you can't actually slaughter it on Yom Tov. So here you did it, and you used it for the Korban Tamid. What's the situation? Can you use it for a Korban? So they basically, Rabbah says, So now Abaye is telling Rava, you asked the following question of Rav Huna or Rav Chisda. There were two versions. And then you told us that this was the answer. And then he quoted this whole verse. I'm not going to go through all the drashot again, but the main one is in the third line in Memchet, Mimashke Yisrael, Mina Mutar Li Yisrael. From there, the pasuk in Yechezkel said you could bring sacrifices from drinks, liquids of the Jews. That means only things that are permitted to Jews. Now, what did they learn from there in the Braita? Mikan amru, ein mivi'im nisachim min hatevel. So then they said, right, maybe you could have said min hamuktzah. I'll just read this inside, even though we read it yesterday. Yachol lo yavi min hamuktzah. Amar, right, maybe you can't bring from muktzah also. Amar, ma tevel miyuchad she'isur gufo garam lo, af kol she'isur gufo garam lo. Yatsa muktzah she'en isur garam lo, eli isur davar achel garam lo. So we said, what do you see here? The Braita says, tevel, yes. Muktzah is not excluded. Why is muktzah not excluded? Which then answers the question about the sin. Muktzah is not included because its issue comes from something external and not something internal in the item itself, right? Let's say it just wasn't prepared, right? This animal wasn't designated, but there's nothing wrong with the animal, right? Tomorrow you can bring the animal. It's not an inherent problem. Like tevel is a more inherent problem. You didn't take the truma masra from it. It's a problem in the guf, in the chefza. So now he says to him like this: if you think muktzah is doraita, mali isur gufo, mali isur davar acher. It should make no difference if it's problematic, if it's forbidden for the item itself, or it's because of some external factor. If it's doraita, it's doraita. It should be the same as tevel then. So he basically says can't possibly be doraita because then we wouldn't make this distinction. One could say if the real distinction is doraita derabanan, then maybe it should have said that's the reason why muktzah is not here, because muktzah is only derabanan. But I don't know why they don't say that. Ve'od ha'atu da'amart, and he says even more so. I'll tell you another reason why atzei muktzah, forgetting about whether it's doraita or not. There's a different reason why you can't put atzei muktzah. Let's assume it is doraita. It wouldn't be in this list of 5 things that you get lashes for. Why? Because you are the one who says, again, he's basically saying Rabba, not like because someone else says it, but you yourself said, Chiluk melachot l'Shabbat ve'ein chiluk melachot l'Yom Tov. This is something we learned a lot in Masechet Shabbat about chiluk melachot. That means if I plant and plow in one Shabbat or in one act, I'm liable for lashes in both, because we distinguish between melachot. Each malacha, you get your own, right? So again, I would get killed. You won't get killed more than twice if I did it unwittingly. That would be shogeg, right? I have to bring 2 korbanot chatat. That's usually the example. But if you would get lashes, you would get then 2 sets of lashes. But you yourself said, En chiluk melachot liyom tov. This is not true for Yom Tov, which means if you do a number of different, right, you do an act in a number of different melachot, you'd only be punished once. Now, according to that, let's go back to the list. What did the list say? 2 of the items on the list were chilul Yom Tov, according to you. 1 was cooking on Yom Tov, and 2 was lighting with the atzei muktzah, that you use muktzah wood. So you can't get, and remember, we said 5 sets of lashes because of each one. That means each one you have to get lashes on your own. Well, you wouldn't get lashes according to you because there's no chiluk melachot on Yom Tov. So basically, he rejects what Rabbah said. Ella, so we tried, right? We tried to get rid of Havara, and we tried to put in, right? The first one we tried to put in was Nevela. We tried to say it was Nevela. Then we said, no, that's Isra Achila. That's a problem. It has to be Isra Bishul based on what Rabbi Chia said. So now we tried to put in Atzei Muktzah. That doesn't work. Now we're going to try another 2. Ella, Apikavara, Va'ayel Atzei Asherah. Maybe it was Avodah Zarah wood. It was wood taken from an Asherah tree, which they worshipped idols from. Then what would be the verse from which you would get lashes? You're not allowed to stick at all to anything you took from the Gentiles that you conquered, and those were the idol worshippers, meaning you can't use their idols. But Amarle Rav Acha Berei de Rav Abaye, he rejects this. Says you can't bring anything despicable into your house, which means you can't use idols. There would be 2 sets of lashes you would get for that, and then it would be 6 and now 5, because that last 5th one has 2 sets of lashes associated with it, so can't be that. Ella, finally, they're going to say, Apikavara va'ayel atze hekdesh. Again, each one it's like we saw the other day, where one differed in terms of his opinion, but kept part of what the person before said and then just adapted it. Likewise here. We started with saying it had to do with what wood you use. We tried, maybe it was muktzah wood, no good. Maybe it was avodah zarah wood, also no good. Maybe it was, and this is going to be the final answer, it was sanctified wood. Okay, it was sanctified to the temple, and then you can't use that. Where's the ashara for this? Where do you get, you always need to have some sort of negative commandment in the Torah about it. So where do you see that? Asara mehacha. Va'asherehem tisrefun be'esh. When you get to the land and you conquer the Gentiles, you're supposed to burn all their asheras, right? All the things that they worshipped. Lo, and the verse continues, Lo ta'asun ken la'Hashem Elokechem. You can't do the same to God. What does that mean? You burn their sanctified items, what they think are sanctified, but you can't burn sanctified items that are sanctified to God. So there you see, you can't burn Atzei Hekdesh and use it for your fire. So therefore, that must have been the fifth thing, and that's the Lo Taseh associated with it. Now we're back to Rav Chisda and Rabbah, and we're going to even go back to our Mishnah. Okay, who remembers even what Mishnah we were up to? So let's remind ourselves. So we have Rabbah and Rav Chisda who talked about you can't cook. This isn't our Mishnah. This was a machloket about whether you can, if you cook from Shabbat, from Yom Tov to Chol, do you get lashes for it? Because we don't say Hoel, or do you not? But really where we started from was the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Mem Vav, Amud Aleph. It said, how are you mafrish challah b'tum'ah b'Yom Tov? Remember this? How do you take challah from dough that became impure? What's the issue? The issue is, remember, if you take the challah, then you can't burn it. If you can't burn it, then it will become chametz. So you're stuck, right? You can't burn it because you're not allowed to burn anything that you're not using for Yom Tov. And, right, that you're not cooking for Yom Tov, and this can't be eaten. It can only be burnt because it's disqualified challah. And you also, though, can't leave the dough on the side because it will rise, and then you'll have a problem with bal yireh, bal yimatzeh. So we have Rabbi Eliezer who said, Lo tikal Hashem ad shetofeh. Bake it at the end, and then be mafresh your challah, because he thinks, if you remember, he says it's still your mamon, right? We had a whole question. Was it because of Tovat Hana'ah? And then we said, that's not the issue. It's because of Ho'il. That's how we got into this whole thing. He says, what's Ho'il? Ho'il, that if you wanted to, you could undo the challah. Therefore, we still view it as your own. And therefore, it's going to be a problem of bal yireh, bal yimatzeh. Therefore, you can't let it rise. So the only solution is bake the whole thing at once. And after you bake it, then you can take the challah. Now, there's something that we didn't really resolve, and that's what's going to come up in today's sugya, which is, it's very nice that he says you want to avoid bal yireh, bal yimatzeh, but in the end, you're baking something that in the end, no one's going to eat, because one of those loaves you're going to give to the Kohen, right? And the Kohen will just burn it, and that will be the end of it. But the point is, you're baking something that the Kohen can't eat on Yom Tov, and therefore no one can eat it on Yom Tov. So it's a problem. How do we even allow you to bake it? Okay, so that's going to be our discussion for today. Rabbi Yoshua had said, if you remember, the second opinion was Ben Betera. He says, take the dough from the beginning, take the challah, and just stick it in cold water. And Rabbi Yoshua had said, Lo zeu chametz muzachim b'bal yireh or bal yimatzeh. That's not a problem. Just be mafresh it. You don't own it because you don't say ho'il. It's not yours now, and it doesn't belong to any kohen because you haven't given it to anyone. So it's ownerless, and therefore there's no problem with bal yireh and bal yimatzeh. But again, what we really haven't resolved is why Rabbi Eliezer thinks that you can bake this on Yom Tov when no one's actually going to eat it. So Rami Bar Chama comes along and suggests, it's kind of funny, there's like a double ho'il here, according to him. Amar Rami Bar Chama, Hade Rav Chisda ve'Rabba machloket to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Saying the machloket, Rav Chisda and Rabba is the exact same machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Why? Do Rabbi Eliezer savar amrin on ho'il? Again, this has to do with baking on Yom Tov. So he says, you can bake it, even though you know, let's say you have 50 loaves. Truma is 1 out of 50. You have 50 loaves. Basically, one of those loaves is going to go to the Kohen. So how do we allow you? It's just like with the guests, right? How do we allow you to bake something that you're not going to end up eating and no one's going to end up eating? So he says, oh, ho'il. What's ho'il? Ho'il, that theoretically, if you wanted to, you could have taken a small portion off of each loaf and given that to the Kohen, even though you're not really going to do that. But theoretically, you could. You don't have to give them a whole loaf. You could give them parts of different loaves. Therefore, since theoretically you could give them parts of loaves and you don't have to give them a whole one, therefore we allow you to bake them all because theoretically you could eat every one of those loaves. So that's why he says, bake it and then take challah, and that's the way to do it. Rabbi Yeshua, who doesn't allow you to bake it at all and says separate it, leave it aside, savar lo amrinan hoyel. He thinks we don't say hoyel. That's why he thinks you can't bake it. Because he says in the end, you're really going to give the Kohen just one of those loaves. So therefore, you ended up baking a loaf that you're never going to eat. And that's a problem. I'm a Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, I don't like your comparison, Rami Bar Chama, and we're going to have another person who doesn't like it for another reason. He says, you can't necessarily compare the two. There's a difference between them. Dilma, and we're going to have two differences coming up. Dilma ad kan lo ka'ama Rabbi Eliezer hatam damrinan hoyel. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer would only say it by the challah case and not in the case of cooking from Yom Tov to Chol. Why? When you put that in the oven, each one is worthy for you to eat. You can eat all of those loaves or any one you want. But if I cook food way more than I and my family can eat, then basically it's not that potentially I could have eaten all of that. I couldn't have. And the only way I could do it is if I could say it like this, some external factor. It's not in my hands. I can't possibly eat all that food. So therefore, if Rabbi Eliezer says I could do it when it comes to the bread, it's because theoretically I could eat all of those loaves. But in this case, I can't necessarily eat all of them and it's dependent on other people. Therefore, he wouldn't say hoel in that case because it's dependent on maybe guests will show up. That's already much more far-fetched or, not attainable necessarily. And we're going to now go from the other perspective of Rav Yeshua. Amar Rav Shesha bered Rav Idi. He's Rav Shisha bered Rav Idi. He says Dilma lohi. Also, I don't think we can compare with the focus on Rav Yeshua this time. Adkan Dilma lohi. Adkan lo ka'amar Rav Yeshua hatam de lo amrinan hoyel eladi kachada de lo chazia lo ledide velo leorchim. In the case of the bread, he says, look, I know in the end that you're just going to give him one of the loaves. If that's the case, you clearly baked one loaf that's going to nobody. Aval hacha, but in this case, but here you made food that theoretically anyone can eat, right? It's the opposite perspective. When you cook that food, if guests show up, they could really eat everything. Therefore, amrinan hoel. He says in the challah case, you're definitely cooking one that no one's going to eat. So you can't say hoel there. But when you cook food and maybe guests will show up, that's definitely a possibility. And theoretically, all that food could actually get eaten. Whereas with the challah, not all that food could actually have gotten eaten because some of it definitely has to be burned. And it's almost like a percentage. The likelihood of you giving a bit from each one is kind of not really likely. And therefore, we're going to say it must be, right, the one loaf. Whereas the likelihood of guests showing up might be much more of a realistic likelihood. Okay, so we basically, Rami Bar Chama compared. These two suggestions were, you can't necessarily compare them, but now we're going to go back to Rami Bar Chama. So the rabbis brought Rami Bar Chama's explanation in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah kibla, Rabbi Zera lo kibla. Rabbi Zera didn't like it. Rabbi Yirmiyah says that's good explanation. I think it is the same machloket. And Rabbi Zera says no. So Amarle Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Rabbi Zera, he starts to bother him about this. He says, it's an interesting response. Milta de kashiram ba'ata ate kama shnei. This is something that's troubled us for many years, and we didn't really understand. Again, we can understand whether you think it's your mamon or not your mamon, but still, how do you get to the next stage? I understand bal yireh, bal yamatzeh. So they debate, is this a problem or is it not? But still, even if you say it's going to be a problem of bal yireh, bal yamatzeh, like Rabbi Eliezer, how do we allow you to bake it when we know you're baking something that we're not going to be using on Yom Tov? So b'may plige Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, right? That's what people have been struggling with. And hashta amaru mishmei de gavarab v'lo nikable. Now, a really prominent person like Rami Bar Chama gave an answer, and you're not going to accept it. Amarle hechia kabla. How can I accept it? He says, and here he's going to try to prove why he didn't want to accept it. To which Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to have a good retort. So he says, Ditanina. If you look at another Braita, this is very common. Our Mishnah said, this is what Rabbi Eliezer says, this is what Ben Batera says, this is what Rabbi Yeshua says, period. But often we have Braita, whether they're Midrashei Halacha or they're Toseftot or they don't appear in any other place. But we often have these Braitot that basically give a conversation between the two and more explanation about a debate that ensued about this. So Amarle Rabbi Yeshua. So there it says in a Braita, Rabbi Yeshua says, Lidvarecha, according to you, Rabbi Eliezer, Harehu over mishum lo taseh kol melacha. It's a problem because of lo taseh kol melacha. you can't, and he says to him, how exactly this question that we brought up before. How, I understand, fine, you're going to have a problem with Bayir Abayi Matzeh, but still, how can you cook? You're cooking something that no one's going to eat. Now, what would you expect Rabbi Eliezer to answer based on Rami Bar Chama? You would expect him to answer, oh, you can say, ho'il, that theoretically you could give him parts of everything, right? But shatikle, he doesn't answer. So he says, Vim ita, if he really had a good explanation, he should have said, oh, because I hold by ho'il. And that would have answered his question. So Amrle. So basically, Rav Yirmiyah says that is not a good proof. Why not? Because look at you, litamech. According to what you just said, I'm going to read you another part. It's unclear whether it's the same source or a different source. Sounds like it's probably the same, but even if not, it's another source. Hadatanina bebraita. It says in the Braita, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, lidvarecha harei over mishum bal yireh bal yimatzeh. Right? Rabbi Eliezer says to Rabbi Yeshua, according to you, how do you resolve the fact that it's bal yireh and bal yimatzeh? Now, what does Rabbi Yeshua say? He has a response, right? He says it's not bal yireh bal yimatzeh because it's not in his property, right? Because we don't say ho'il in the other ho'il, right? That since you can undo the challah. But what happens in that Braita? Shatikle, he doesn't respond. Now, hachinami de lo ahadrole, right? Also, he doesn't have any response. Hakam ahadrole b'manitin, but he did have a response. How do we know he had a response? Because our Mishnah says he has a response. Look at our Mishnah, Ditznan, and look at the wording of Rabbi Yeshua in the Mishnah, which is really a response to what Rabbi Eliezer said, which is lo zehu chamesh musarim alav mishum bal yireh bal yimatzeh. In other words, right? In the Braita, Rabbi Eliezer says, but it's bal yireh bal yimatzeh. And look at our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yeshua says, that's not considered bal yireh and bal yimatzeh because he doesn't own it, right? So he responds to him. So therefore, elashatikle bebraita mahadule b'manitin. So what's the issue? Well, in the Braita, it just didn't mention his response, but he did have a response in the Mishnah. It doesn't mean he didn't have a response. The fact that someone's silent in the Braita isn't necessarily an indicator that they didn't have anything to answer. Right? Often we say shatikle is that you don't have anything to say. But here it's clear he did have a response because his response appeared in the Mishnah. Therefore, Achanami, likewise, you could say when Rabbi Eliezer didn't respond to Rabbi Yeshua, Achanami de lo ahadrole, hakam ahadrole. Sorry, I skipped some. I went back. Hachanami, sorry, I went to the wrong Hachinami. Right? Maybe his response appeared in a different Braita that we just don't have. So in other words, Rami Bar Chama could still be correct. The fact that he was silent doesn't prove anything. And that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah says against Rabbi Zera, who thought that we don't hold like Rami Bar Chama. Okay, Tanya. Rabbi Omer halacha ke Rabbi Eliezer. Now we're going to get into halacha lamasa about what you do in this case. So he says, we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer that you in fact take the challah after. Rabbi Yitzchak amar halacha ke ben betera. We go back to ben beteras, which really the Gemara didn't deal with at all, and we said maybe because it's not really a great solution. But here he paskins like him that you stick it in cold, you take the challah and you stick it in cold water, and that will prevent it from rising. V'kama shi'urisa. Now they ask another question. They're getting very practical here. How much of a dough can you knead on Pesach and not be worried that it's going to rise? The idea is, we've talked about this before, while you're kneading the dough, you're preventing it somewhat from rising. If that's the case, then if you use a really big dough, then you're not going to be dealing with all of the dough at once, right? We all know when you knead a big dough, it's much more complicated, and you're always kneading just part of it at a time, which means another part of it might actually rise. So they limit the size of dough that you can knead on Pesach in order to make your matzah so that it doesn't leaven, or before Pesach, right? In making your matzah in general. So what's the amount? Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch Omer b'chitin kabim u'besorin shloshet kabim. When it comes to chitim, it's 2 kav. Each kav is 24 egg bulks. Okay, I did find the measurement. It's 41.33 ounces. So that's a kav. So 2 kabim is the amount that you can do if you're doing a dough of wheat, and seorim, barley, is 3 kav. Rabbi Natan Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer chiluf hadvarim. Oh, sorry, I skipped. No, I didn't skip. No, sorry. Rabbi Natan says it's the opposite, okay? The question, this is a debate. Are chitim more likely to rise or less likely? So if you say the first version, seorim, you have a larger amount because they're less likely to rise. According to Rabbi Natan, and Rabbi Eliezer, it's the opposite. It's that the seorim are more likely to rise, and therefore they're 2, and the chitim are 3. But now we're going to stick with the first version because the first version was what Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said. So 2 and 3, 2 for wheat, 3 for barley. But now we're going to have a question on that. The Hatanya, it says in another Braita, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Bechitin shloshet kabin, ubesorin arba'a kabin. 3 and 4, not 2 and 3. So, and it's the same person. So how do we resolve that? Lo kashya, it's not difficult. Haba chasichata, haba ma'alyata. It depends if the grains were good grains or bad quality grains. Bad quality grains are going to be less likely to rise. That's why they're bad quality. So if it's bad quality grains, we're going to say 3 for wheat, 4 for barley, instead of the better ones, which are 2 for wheat and 3 for barley. So now they add an interesting line. If you're into mathematics, this will be obvious. Amar Rav Papa Shmamina, Grian chite chasichata michite ma'alyata tfemi de grian sare chasichata misare ma'alyata. The difference between good and bad grains in wheat is a bigger differential than, and they're much worse than the barley to the barley. Okay, why? Because de'ilu hatam tilta v'hacha riva. The difference between 2 and 3 is a third, and the difference between 3 and 4 is only a quarter. Okay, so you see here that the difference is a greater, right, ratio in the wheat than the barley. Amarav. Kava milonga'a lepischa v'chein lechala. He says the kav of the place called Milogan is the kav that they use there. We're now going to see different people use different measurements. A kav didn't, right? We say it very nicely. Oh, a kav is 24 egg bulks and it's worth 41.33 ounces. Okay, you could say that, but it depends where you were and how you measured your kabim. Sometimes a kav in a different place, and we've seen this before, was a different measurement. So he says, when we're talking, and here he seems to differ because they said 2 kabim and 3 kabim, and he says, no, it's a kav. A kav is the amount you use for Pesach, and it's also the amount that's chayav in challah. If you use that, right, that's the amount that's perfect for Pesach, and if you use that, you're obligated to take challah. There's always this minimum amount, to which the Gemara is going to question. What do you mean? Tanya, but it says, actually it's Hatzanan, it says in the Mishnah in Chala, Chameshet Revaim Kemach Va'od Chayavim B'Chala. You need 5/4, meaning 1 1/4 kabin, and a little more. That's when you're chayav in chala, not a kav. So how could you have said that? So he answers exactly what I said before, which is hachi kamar. Kaba melong gna'a nami ahai shiur hakai. In other words, the kav that they use in that place is 1 1/4. Okay, so therefore we're going to say that's exactly the same amount. Okay, and that's the amount he says you can use on Pesach, and that's the amount that's chayav in chala. Amar Rav Yosef. Now we're going to start talking about women, because the women seem to be the ones who were kneading all the doughs and preparing the matzah on Pesach, which we talked about before. Right nowadays, you don't really see women in matzah factories, as far as I know. But in those days, it was always the women who did it. You can see them mentioned in many sources. So now Amar Rav Yosef. Hane Nashe Didan, our women, the women we know, Nahug Lemepa Kafiza Lepischa. They break it up into 3/4 kav doughs, and they're extra careful. They want to make sure that the dough doesn't rise, so they split it up into 3/4 of a kav. So now, Abai has a very good question on Rav Yosef. Remember, Abai is always questioning Rav Yosef. He was a student, and he was a very sharp student. He always asked good questions. I'm like, Abai, my da'atech lechumra. What are you saying? The women that you know, so they want to be stringent, right? So they cut the dough into smaller parts and knead it separately. Lechumra. But then if they're doing 3/4 of a kav, they're not going to be obligated to separate the challah. So they're being stringent, but it's actually leading to a leniency because then no one has to take challah from their doughs. So Amarle, da'avdan ke Rabbi Eliezer. No, they still are obligated in challah because they hold like Rabbi Eliezer. What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? De Tanya, I think it should probably also be a de Tanan. Yeah, de Tanan, Mishnah Masechet Challah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Remember Ridiata pot, we said it's a chokhmah, the way they took the bread out of the oven because it's stuck to the sides of the dough. So rodeh means you take it out of the oven once it's baked already. V'noten lasal. Hasal mitzarfan lechala. The sal, once it goes into a basket with other breads, that makes you chayav in challah. So if you put them, normally we say it's when it's dough, and if they're with together in the dough, yes, they have to be touching or right next to each other, covered by the same thing, somehow together if you're going to take challah on a bunch of different doughs. But here they say, even once it's baked and you put it in a basket, that's mechayev challah. So when they made their matzahs, they did it separately in small batches, but then they put them together in one basket, and then they were obligated to take challah. And that's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And not only is it Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, but Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. He said in the name of Shmuel, halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. We paskin that way. Amar Lei says, wait, but that's not exactly right, because Vaha Itmar Allah, wasn't it said about this? Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Lo Shanu Ella. This is a biased question back to Rabbi Yosef. Lo Shanu Ella ki karot shel Bavel, shenoshchotzo mizo. Aval ka'achin lo. That's only loaves that kind of touch each other when they're in the bowl, and they sort of, like nishicha is like to kiss, right? They kind of kiss, but they're next to each other and kind of together with each other. But ka'achin, but long ones, long flat ones, they look very separate from each other. They don't sort of connect with each other in the bowl. Those you're not obligated in, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So he says, Yeshua ben Levi doesn't bother me because ha'itmar lama Rabbi Chanina afilu kachin. Rabbi Chanina held even kachin. So therefore, we're going to say that. Oh yeah, sorry, my mistake. Nishicha is to bite, not to kiss. That's nishika. I got confused for a minute. I was thinking of it like that, but you're right. It's to bite. Okay, they more like they bite each other. Okay, again, what exactly that means, but kind of one gets in the space of the other, maybe you would say. But if they're straight, and kind of flat, then no. But he says no. Rabbi Chanina said even kachin in the same basket would be obligated. Okay, and therefore, again, these women made separate batches, but it didn't lead to a leniency because in the end they were obligated to take challah when they put them all together. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. So the Rabbi Yirmiyah we saw before, now he's going to assume his classic Rabbi Yirmiyah style, which is all these kind of nunicky questions that often like what if, and his what if questions usually lead to tekus, which in our case it's also going to, which is there is no answer. So here comes his question. Right now we said, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you put them in a bowl, they're all considered together, a basket, right? Sal is a basket. So here he asks, Tavla she'enla levizbazin, what if it's a flat tray that doesn't have sides to it? Are you going to say they're together here or not? So mahu, toch kli be'inan v'haleka, do you need an inside, like a receptacle? And this doesn't have an inside of the kli because there's no sides. O dilma avir kli be'inan v'ha'ika, or do you say you just need airspace, right? There's a kli underneath. So the fact that there's airspace above that could be considered in the same utensil. So maybe it would. And the answer is teku. We don't know the answer. Again, teku either is short for take home, it will stand, or as many like to say, it's Rashi Tevot. It's an acronym for Tishbi Itaretz Kushiyot Uba'ayot. Right? That one day Eliyahu will come and answer all our questions. Tanya, another braita about this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hasal Mitzarfan. Okay, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that we saw before, but now we're going to see some other opinions. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Tanur Mitzarfan. It's the oven that joins them together. Meaning if you bake them in the oven at the same time, this is almost like a lead into our next Mishnah, if you bake them in the oven at the same time, then they're all obligated in challah together. This is what we said before about them, biting each other or being together with each other, then they're mitzarfot. New Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Shalosh nashim lashot ke'achat ve'ofot b'tanor echad zer achar zeh. This is describing a situation where women didn't always have their own ovens. And we see this often. They shared ovens. So now what happens when you share an oven and you're making your matzah dough? Can you all knead at the same time? Or do you have to be a little, right? Can you do it synchronized, even though in the end, there's not going to be enough space for everybody's matzah to go into the oven at the same time. So if I start kneading my dough and you start kneading your dough and someone else starts kneading their dough all at the same time, our loaves are going to presumably be ready at the same time. We're going to want to put them in the oven at the same time we can. What will happen? Someone will have to wait. Their dough might start to rise. So Rabban Gamliel says, not a problem. They just make sure to keep dealing with their dough. They make sure it doesn't rise and it's fine. Chachamim omrim, shalosh nashim oskot bebatzeh ke'achat. There's three stages basically. There's kneading, there's setting up the dough, the shape of it, and then there's baking. So this reminds me of those songs that you do with harmonies and everyone's at a different point in the song, right? So everyone starts, right? I start kneading, and then when I get to the next stage, you start kneading, and when I get to the next stage, you get to the next stage, and the first one starts. That's what he says you have to do. Rabbi Akiva Omer, there's a funny line, I kind of like it. Lo kol anashim, velo kol ha'etzim, velo kol hatanurim shavim. What do you mean? Not everyone's going to knead their dough at the same time, right? You just like this line about not all women are the same. Don't just stick them in a category, right? And interesting, they're comparing them to, I don't think it's really comparing them, but they're in the same line about the wood and about the ovens. But it's kind of saying, yeah, don't think all women are all the same. No, everyone does their dough differently, right? How many times I make the same exact challah recipe as my friend, and they do not seem to be the same recipe at all, right? You would never guess. So anyway, it's this great line, not everything's equal. And we're going to see in the Gemara exactly what he means by this. Zehaklal. Now, you would think this is Rabbi Akiva, but we're going to see later in the Gemara that Zehaklal is actually the response of Rabban Gamliel to what Rabbi Akiva says. He says, Tafach tiltosh b'tzonen. In other words, I don't care that they all, so first of all, it's not so clear what Rabbi Akiva is saying, right? Rabbi Akiva says they're not all shavim, right? So he doesn't exactly say, so what does that mean? Okay, so they say that what he means is that he says you can't do it all at the same time, because even though it might not rise, right, they're saying that there's all sorts of other factors you have to take into consideration here, right? That there's a lot of other things going on and you have to be conscious of them. It's not just say, oh yeah, you can all do it and it'll all be fine. But there's a lot of different factors that affect, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what they are. And then to which Rabban Gamliel responds, because this we're going to see in a Braita, that this last line is really a response of Rabban Gamliel, Ze'aklal, tafach tiltosh b'tzonen. In other words, of course, these women have to be aware of what's going on, and therefore, they'll just check their dough if they're waiting around and it starts to rise. So they'll put cold water, they'll brush cold water over it, and that will prevent it from rising. So the Gemara starts off and says, Tanu Rabbanan, let's bring a Braita, Lasha, Himekatefet, V'chaverta Lasha Tachtea. This is basically describing the middle opinion of the Chachamim, that everyone goes at a different stage, right? The Mekatefet seems to be, before we talked about it's brushing, but here it seems to be arranging the dough. So one's Lasha, and then she starts to arrange the dough, and chaverta lasha tachtea, and then the next one starts kneading. Mikatefet, when she gets up to the kituf part, then he ofa, then right, the first one starts baking, v'chaverta mikatefet tachtea, the other one does the middle, and hashlishit lasha, and then the first one starts ofa, when she gets to baking, he lasha b'chaverta ofa tachtea, hashlishit mikatefet b'chozrot chalila. Okay, basically this is the rounds. That's why that song kept me thinking about it, where it just keeps going around and around. Right, so he says as long as they're still handling the dough, it won't leaven. Rabbi Akiva Omer lo kol anashim. Tanya. So now we're going to have a Braita about Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Damti lifnei Rabban Gamliel. I asked Rabban Gamliel when he said, oh, you three women, you can all do it at the same time. I said to him, Yalamdenu Rabbeinu, benashim zrizot or benashim she'en zrizot? Are we talking about women who need faster or women who need slower? Exactly as you wrote, Becky. In fact, Rashi a little bit has it as nashim atzlaniot. He puts it a little into the negative terms. We talked about those nashim atzlaniot before, right? Are they lazy women, or are they, right? We all know, I know in my house in the kitchen, right? I can sometimes be there with some of my, won't say who, but there's people, I watch them and they're so slow in the kitchen. And I'm like, whoa, you can do this so much faster, right? Everybody works at a different pace. So now they say, we've seen this before, right? They do use different kinds of wood. If you use wetter wood, it will take longer for it to bake in the oven. Was the oven preheated or was it not preheated? So it all depends on so many circumstances, and you have to basically go by the circumstances. Amar li, so then now here you see it's Rabban Gamliel's response to him, right? If it starts to leaven, then you put it in cold, and that's how you deal with it. Yes, it's true. I agree with you that it might be a little bit different each time, but you just pay attention, right? It's interesting that they relied on the women. They thought that the women were aware enough to pay attention and keep the laws, right? People, not like people were always suspect of women. They don't know anything, right? Wait till we get to tomorrow. See tomorrow's daf, which is a bit harsh about all these people who are not knowledgeable and the approach of the rabbis to people who didn't have knowledge at their disposal, okay, which they call the Amei Haaretz. Very harsh stuff, so beware. But to them, it was all the people with knowledge. But it's interesting that it's preceded by this sugya about the women. They really relied on them, even though clearly, again, the women were. It wasn't that they thought women weren't knowledgeable. They thought that women had speciality in certain areas. Baking was their thing, and they knew the laws about what they needed to know about. So they were knowledgeable in this area, and they clearly relied on them. Okay, new Mishnah, and with this we'll finish. It's pretty short. Se'ur yisaref v'hochlo patur. Remember, this is chametz nuksha. This is something that doesn't fully rise. So it's starting to rise, but it hasn't leavened yet. If you burn it, even though it's chametz nuksha only, v'hochlo patur, but if you eat it, you're exempt. Okay, you're not obligated in karet because it's only chametz nuksha. Siduk, but once you get to the stage of siduk where it cracks, yisaref, it burns, v'hochlo chayav karet, and if you eat it, that's already considered. That's when it leavens. Ezu se'ol. So now what is it? And we're going to have two opinions. We read this already. Kik karne chagavim, like the antenna of the grasshoppers, which means little cracks. Siduk shenitarvu stakim zebazef. Already the cracks join together, and you have a lot of cracks. Don't really cracks. That's already going to be the second stage. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim omrim, which we're going to see in a minute, is Rabbi Meir. Ze v'zeh ochlo chayav karet. What you just said, both those stages, is actually karet. That's real chametz. Ve'ezu si'ol kol shechsifu panav ka'adam shamdu sarotav. I realized that the last time I read this, I explained it incorrectly. Chsifu panim is paled, like silver gets pale. So they say the outside of the dough started becoming pale, or the dough itself became pale, like someone whose hair stood up on end, like scared. When you get scared, you get pale. So that's what it means. The dough became pale. So Tanu, which is an earlier stage. That's what he thinks is chametz nuksha, which you're not chayav karet. So Tanu Rabbanan, they bring a bright in the Gemara. Ezu se'ol kol shechsifu panav ka'adam shamdu sarotav. This is obviously the Chachamim's opinion, which we'll see in a second, is Rabbi Meir. Siduk kekarnei chagavim, right? The stage that Rabbi Yehuda thinks is chametz nuksha, he thinks is chametz gamor, real chametz. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Okay, this is all Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, interesting. This time Chachamim is Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so Chachamim omrim ezu seor kekarnei chagavim. That's Rabbi Yehuda's approach. Siduk shenitarvu stakim zebazeh, and then it says v'zeh v'zeh ochlo chayav karet, which makes no sense because what Rabbi Yehuda sounds like he's saying is both of those you're chayav karet, which we're not. The first stage is chametz nuksha. You're not obligated. You don't get karet. So the Gemara asked that question. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah? Seor yisaref ochlo patur divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Ema Rabbi Meir zevazeh ochlo chayav karet. He says, oh, according to Rabbi Meir, the two stages of Rabbi Yehuda you'd be obligated karet because he views them differently than Rabbi Yehuda. He thinks those two stages are actually karet. Amarava, my time of Rabbi Meir. What's his reason why he thinks kekarnei chagavim, those little cracks, are already problematic? Because ein lecha kol sedek v'sedek milamala she'en lo kama stakim milamata. He says if there's cracks in the top, there must be clearly cracks. It's indicative that there's cracks underneath. It's not if there were only cracks on top, he would agree. But he says that must mean that it cracked already underneath, and therefore he thinks it already leavened. I just want to add one thing before I end, which is I see an interesting question, which is Abba Shaul was a dough kneader. So what do you mean the women were kneaders? So I think there's a distinction. Abba Shaul was a kneader by profession. Like this is like we have nowadays, right? Many women cook at home, but most of the chefs are male, right? The professional people who had jobs in that were the men, but the women were doing it in most of the households. So I think that's the possible distinction. First of all, even though they talk about the women, it's very likely there were men who did this, but the majority were women probably. But I think the main distinction between Abba Shaul is he's called a gabal. That's his job. Here we're talking about women who are just baking in their houses for their families. So I would think that that's a possible distinction. Anyway, it's interesting things to think about the women and how things were in those times and what the kitchens look like and how if you remember, their ovens were outdoors and they used to often just share ovens and go into the yard of the next door neighbor and use the oven. And that definitely comes up in lots of sources, right? It shows their poverty level, even a basic thing like an oven, they didn't necessarily have. So anyway, food for thought. We will end here. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.